so that we have plenty of time for public discussion and questions for Steve and for the panel members, we're going to get right into the presentation of the cultural resources chapter. So I want to bring up Monty Rodgers from Stephen R. Brond Associates to give that presentation. And then I think from there we'll go right into the panel discussion. We won't have a break unless there's a little bit of time to do that, but I'm guessing there won't be. So where did Monty go? There he is. Okay. Thanks.
Hello. As I was just introduced, I'm Monty Rodgers. I work for Stephen Brond and Associates, and we've been conducting cultural resource work for the Pebble Project since 2004, and it's ongoing through this year as well. And I'll be primarily focused on the EBD, although I will provide some fieldwork highlights on post-EBD research. So I'll start off with what are cultural resources. And it's similar to natural resources, but it's a fancy term for what's important to people for cultural reasons. And we're generally interested in stuff that's 50 years old or older. And some examples include social institutions, historic places, cultural sites, artifacts, documents, and traditional ways of life. And so for the purpose of the cultural resources baseline study, and it was to characterize these resources of the area prior to project development. So I'll be discussing the three study areas today, starting with the mine study area, then the transportation corridor study area, and then the Cook Inlet study area. And you can see them out there in the purple boxes. So for our cultural resources study, we looked at relevant literature and archival review, so other scientific reports, historical ethnographies, and government archives. We've went out and conducted field surveys, and we've also interviewed local community members and conducted place name research. So I'll start off discussing the field surveys. In 2004 to 2008 were for the EBD, and I'll briefly highlight some of our 2009 2011 post-EBD field research. So our field surveys serve two purposes. Primarily, characterize the cultural resources of the study area, and that's for the EBD, and sort of our for our EBD and for the post-EBD is assessing and surveying areas where ground disturbing locations, or locations for ground disturbing activities may occur. So I'll start off talking about the mine study area for our survey work. So prior to our surveys, 2 HRS sites were identified by other surveys in the area. And HRS sites are it's a state of Alaska name, and it's the Alaska Heritage Resource Survey sites. So the state of Alaska maintains a database of all documented cultural sites. They're generally older than 50 years. And these are the only 2 in the database prior to our survey starting in 2004. So here's where we've surveyed for the EBD and post-EBD research. The orange was for the EBD, and the black is post-EBD. For our studies, we've dug a lot of subsurface tests out there. We found sites for the EBD, 20, and then later our analysis, we did some additional analysis, and we realized there was a mistake in the EBD, and that 5 of the sites we recorded were either natural, so they were not man-made, or modern, and that means they're less than 50 years old. And in our post-EVD research, we found 30 sites, with the oldest dating to around 3,500 years ago. There again, so here are the AHRS sites, so the sites documented in the state database, the AHRS sites, we've found since 2004. The orange ones are 2004 to 2008, and the black ones are 2009 to 2011. And this is all within the mine study area. And here's an example of the types of sites we found out there. And off to the left is the AHRS number, so the state designated number, the site name. We typically don't give sites names. And then a brief description. So you see that there's some ancestral houses out there with stone tools. You see some historic villages, Russian Orthodox churches, the Williamsport Road, I think everyone's familiar with out there. And that road, which was a former Denana Trail, is actually eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And just a couple of another surface site where folks were making stone tools is another example. So I'll just show you some pictures here of different sites we found out in the mine study area during our surveys. And there's a stone tent ring you can kind of see in there. See, right in there. Here's another one. And this is kind of an interesting one. Here's a small pit feature here. Maybe an ancestral house. And here's a stone cairn. And these tend to mark either trails or work to help assist in caribou drives and stuff like that. And this one's actually toppled over time. And here's one of the sites we documented is actually a historic trapping camp. And you can see over there that this tree's been limbed. And here's an old Chevron gas can. And the bear guard we were working with actually was from the area. Thought he knew whose family had traditionally used this area and whose camp it may belong to. So that's kind of interesting as well. And also within the mine study area, there's snow patches that we tend to investigate, because anyone who's done a bit of caribou hunting out there know during the summer and stuff, they like to hang out there to avoid the bugs. And they're usually up high to catch some of the wind. And so we check up there for the preservation of organic artifacts, such as stuff made of bone or wood or leather. And here's this one we didn't find anything at, I think, except for a ground squirrel skeleton. So here's some of the artifacts we found out there. So when folks are making stone tools, they start off with a chunk of rock, and it's called a core. And you can see out here where they're hitting it with another stone and driving off these large pieces of rock called flakes or debitage. And here again, you can see the rippling coming off where they hit it. And so here's some of those flakes and debitage that come off of there. And there's some bigger ones. And here's some smaller ones when folks get more of a refined tool and they're taking antler tine and working the edges and sharpening it up. And sometimes folks just pick up a piece of already naturally broken rock and work the edges, such as frost shatter. And we found this at a site with a lot of, well, actually where that big core was in the first slide. Then here's a nice spear pointer knife we found. And see, it's a little asymmetrical. That edge is a little bit straighter than this edge, and here's where it was hafted. And here's a hammerstone. So folks had gripped this in one or two hands. Actually, this was pretty large, so two hands. And here's where they're hitting that big cord I showed in the first slide and driving off flakes and stuff to make stone tools. And there's a few other types of artifacts. We found a groove stone at one site, groove cut in there or chipped in there or ground, and another one up there. And here, when we use the term biface, all it means is that this artifact has been worked on both sides. And this could be a core that folks were taking small flakes off to make knives, or it could actually be a tool in itself. Here's an example of one of the sites we found out there during our EBD research. And it's amazing out there because not a lot of vegetation growth is fairly slow out there, so we often find a lot of artifacts on the surface. And this site happened to have artifacts on the surface and below the ground surface. Here's one of our archaeologists digging a test out there. And here's some of the artifacts we recovered from that site for the EBD research. And here's one of those little unmodified stone flakes. Here's one where someone took probably an antler tine and worked the edges a bit to sharpen it up, or for scraping or cutting or something. And here's 3 other bifaces. And there again, these are either probably spear points or knives, and they're just worked on both sides. And those are all within the mine study area. For the transportation corridor study area, for our field surveys, here's all the sites identified prior to our surveys out there. So quite a few, which makes sense. It's closer to the lake. And for our field surveys in the transportation corridor, we've only made one trip out there and visited 2 very small locales. One was a possible bridge crossing, and one was a core yard in Iliamna, and these are both in the EBD as well. Up there is a possible bridge crossing, and down there's the core yard, and there's the airstrip at Iliamna. There's a picture of the core yard. Picture of the possible bridge location. And at that bridge location, as you can see, it got to be a little late in the year. But there's a surface depression here, and there's a few of them at this site. But we didn't get a chance to test because the ground is starting to freeze and the weather conditions were not ideal. So we have not entered this site into the state designated system because we haven't tested it yet. I want to make sure that, because as everyone knows, there's a lot of holes in the woods, and there's a lot of reasons for them, some cultural, some natural. So for our Cook Inlet study area, here are the sites identified before we conducted any surveys out there. And we made 4 trips out there in 2 in 2005 and 2 in 2007, and we identified 2 new sites out there, and both date to about 1,500 years ago. And here's the locations of our surveys. And here's myself, in fact, just a few days into my first trip to Alaska out in the field working with some our other staff that were on that trip are not pictured. But I'm at a rock shelter where we identified one of the sites. And this is along the coast. And there's the 2 sites we found during our Cook Inlet surveys for the EBD. So another part of our cultural research for the EBD involved interviews with local residents. And we contacted 7 communities, and we conducted interviews in 2007. We did 32 interviews. And we, in our interviews, we tried to work with knowledgeable elders about resources in Bristol Bay and Cook Inlet, and we had to mark out areas on 1 to 250 USGS maps. And we asked about a variety of cultural resource sites, including village sites, cabins, trails, trap lines, portages, battle sites. And from those interviews, we got quite a few resources identified, 783 in fact, and 377 of those show up in the mine or transportation corridor study areas, and none were identified in the Cook Inlet study area. The remaining 406 are outside of the study areas. So they go, you'll see on this next slide here, there again is the study areas. And so we get stuff way up into Lake Clark and even down into Katmai a bit. So for the mine study area from the interviews, here's the different, some of the sites that were identified. So you got a lot of camps and a lot of trails, and most if not all of these trails are primarily winter trails. And here's some other types of sites found in the mine study area. These are battle sites and reindeer stations. So there's reindeer stations, there's battle sites. Here's some more. These are place names. These are some more place names. These are some burial locations. And here's an example of the interview identified sites. So you got, over here's the number, an identifying number we use in the EBD, the map, the map number that the feature is on, and the feature type, so cultural resource, camp, that type of thing, and a brief description and time period. And we tried to show, for the cultural resource section, we just focused on stuff that were multi-generational or 50 years old or older. And we relied on the folks we interviewed to tell us the age. So another aspect of our EBD cultural resource research was documenting place names in the study areas. Because in 2004, a meeting in Ekwok, the communities asked for indigenous place names to be included in the baseline document. So we relied on published sources and came up with 950 place names in the Bristol Bay and Cook Inlet drainages. And there's a map showing them, and there again, way up and way outside, and most are within the transportation corridor study area. So for the EBD research in the mine study area, there's 16 place names, both Dena'ina and Yupik. And there they are. And the numbers can be found in the table in the EBD. And here's the map number as well in the EBD. And so they're scattered a bit. And here's some of the corresponding numbers. And so you see stuff for creeks, villages, and just more broader geographic areas like the Iliamna Lake lowlands, and Groundhog Mountain, Cockatoo River. So part of our fieldwork highlights of post-EBD research is that Karen Evanoff of the Lake Clark National Park, who's from Non-Dalton, published a large volume on Dena'ina place names for Southwest Alaska. And so for the mine study area, we compared her work to ours. And this resulted in an additional 32 documented Dena'ina and Yupik place names in the mine study area. And here they are. And little pink circle names are actually places that we document in the EBD that were not in Karen's research. The pink stars in both EBD and in Karen's research. Little green triangles are in Karen's work only. And we had some place names that didn't have location data in the EBD, but Karen had found location data for them, and so those are marked by green stars. So for the transportation corridor study area, there's 103 place names, so almost 3 times as many as in the mine study area. And these are all primarily Denina. Quite a few there. And I mean, they go from all the way up into the Lake Clark area and around the lake, and also along that Williamsport Road. So for the Cook Inlet study area, there's 24 Denina place names. And a lot of them are focused down here where that Williamsport Road comes out, which was a ancestral Denina travel route. So that makes sense. Here's some of the names and some of their location descriptions. And kind of one aspect of the post-EBD our field efforts I thought I'd just touch on is that we actually work with PLP to train their employees in recognizing archaeological sites and become familiar with the ancestral history out there. And we go over archaeology, the different laws, different artifact types. And this has been very beneficial. We've had a lot of bear guards and also drillers say, hey, I might have found something. You guys want to go look at it? And in some cases, yes, they've found stuff. So it's been great. And they found it before ground disturbing activities. Some of our ongoing stuff, we continue literature review, reviewing the HRS database. We turn in annual reports every year from 2004 up until now to the Office of History and Archaeology for the state, and we conducted additional fieldwork in 2012. So that's about the end of my presentation.